Thank you. Okay, I'm going to do a quick presentation on how we apply virtual reality as a tool for delivering exposure therapy in people with anxiety disorders, predominantly people with PTSD, and we do this in a way to promote extinction learning. I have a very strong behavioral root in how I see PTSD forming and how we can address it. So after I cover a brief introduction to virtual reality, then I'll talk about the VR exposure therapy area, hot area, been around actually since the mid-90s, and then talk about different ways that we've tried to move the needle forward in terms of improving treatment by addressing brain processes, how we better can assess PTSD, and also some of the implications in terms of sleep, memory reconsolidation, and things that we might need to really pay attention to from a more clinical perspective. So I'm located at the Institute for Creative Technologies, part of University of Southern California. Our main focus is to design, develop, and evaluate virtual reality simulations. We get a lot of money from the Army. We're an Army UARC, a university-affiliated research center. And when the center was created, the aim was to have it in LA so that we could be close to the Hollywood talent pool to bring in special effects, gaming, and narrative into simulation. So in that building, we're sort of like the unholy alliance between Hollywood, the military, and academia, but somehow we get along. And my lab is the MedVR Lab, interdisciplinary group that since 1996 is focused on psych, cognitive, motor, and virtual human work. Just a quick walkthrough. Give you a little idea of a VR simulation you'll see more of in a few minutes that we use for delivering exposure therapy to treat PTSD, as well as assess and possibly prevent PTSD. That's what it looked like about 7 or 8 years ago, but in this case, we translated what was developed as a treatment tool into an assessment tool of cognitive function. So within an immersive simulation, much like the earlier presenter, you can deliver a controlled stimulus environment that's functionally relevant to the needs of the assessment and the user's experience. So we developed a series of tests with assessing attention, memory, and executive function in these kinds of simulations. We don't just do Army work or military work. There's an old mental rotation assessment and training system from back in 1997 or 8. Back then, VR was very expensive and complicated and crappy. The VR was viewed as a failed technology after 1995 or so. The vision was sound for its use, as it is today, but technology was not mature. So that system basically cost about $300,000 to produce. So we ended up building a ton of visual spatial applications on it to prove our value. But, the good news is technology's matured, as we all know, and we can do pretty intense, great, controlled research and treatment in VR at a very low cost, actually. This is another app that we developed for assessing children with ADHD and other attention process impairments. As the child sees looking around in the functionally relevant context of a virtual classroom, while we can systematically control distraction while the child attends to stimuli on the board, like paper airplane just got thrown from a kid in the back, school bus going by. Also, we do work in physical and occupational therapy, motor science areas, sometimes where you can track a user, in this case with a very low-cost tracking system, Microsoft Kinect type camera, no wires, instrumentation markers on the user, can track their movement, put them in a game-based VR environment to make the very boring, repetitive activity of physical rehab or cognitive rehab fun and engaging. And this is more modern stuff where we use an immersive environment with a head-mounted display with a mini tracker, what's called Leap Motion Tracker. You can actually track the hands fairly precisely, so we can look at upper extremity rehab bimanual coordination in a first-person format, no longer limited to third-person presentations. Finally, some of our work with virtual humans, and here's an example of a training system for social workers learning how to do a clinical interview with the military population.
Good afternoon, Sergeant Castilla. What brings you in today?
Can you hear
Well,
that?
my wife told me she thought I should talk to someone. She's been pretty concerned about me since a soldier suicided on base last week.
Did you happen to know the soldier?
Yes. He wasn't a friend, but I met the Marine once or twice. He seemed normal at the time. I guess I'm afraid I might end up like him.
Do you have any plans to hurt yourself?
No. It certainly crossed my mind, especially lately. I just need it all to stop. Sometimes I can't handle it.
So a lot of things going on in that. That's from 2012.
Sergeant, are you
We've
feeling
evolved it
depressed?
fairly significantly, but I like to say it gives novice clinicians a chance to screw up a bunch with a virtual patient before they get their hands on a live one. And finally, another area is taking these various levels of AI-infused virtual human agents, making them available for other purposes. So in this case, an online system that service members, veterans could interact with privately and anonymously to get answers to their questions about PTSD and TBI. Folks that are loath to go see a shrink, but they know they're having issues, so they could go and interact with this guy, do some light self-assessment, get information, and get advice. And I'll just let him introduce himself real quick.
Well, I'm not a real person, if that's what you're asking. But I'm based on the personality and experiences of real soldiers and Marines. I'm still just a piece of software, but I'm getting better all the time. So hopefully I can be a helpful piece of software to talk to.
So with that said, general definition from a technocentric perspective for VR, combination of enabling technologies, computers, interface devices, display devices, ways tracking human user movement within functionally relevant or imaginary simulations. The more HCI, human computer interaction relevant definition, which I prefer, is basically ways that we can interact with computers in a complex state in a more naturalistic way, something that perhaps field of HCI could benefit from, so we're not limited to hunting and pecking on a keyboard. So in the areas of mental health, rehabilitation, and research, you know, I think the best metaphor is aviation simulation, something that this facility has had a good hand in. And, you know, basically the metaphor being just like an aircraft simulator can test and train piloting ability under a range of controllable conditions, we can now build VR simulations to test, train, teach, and treat human functioning across a range of areas. And in some sense, it's the ultimate Skinner box, a way for us to be able to precisely control stimulus presentation, but in the context of a functionally relevant environment. A lot of value in that for a lot of purposes. People in neuroscience obviously recognize the value of this as an experimental protocol tool, and clinicians are catching on as well. You know, there was a small group in the mid-90s that hung in there with the vision, but now more and more clinicians are recognizing the value, and in this survey made predictions about the impact of clinical VR in the next 10 years, coming in 4th out of 45. By the way, 3 of the other top 5 were also tech-based solutions, mobile apps, online therapy, CBT, and teletherapy. So, you know, the traditional method of sit on the couch and pay a lot of money for psychoanalysis 3 times a week, maybe that will be changing as technology evolves, or maybe it'll be amplified. So since 1994, we've seen applications going from exposure therapy for specific phobias being a primary target to these areas where we've seen over the last 20 years solid research indicating value, added value, using VR either as an assessment, treatment, or tool for scientific research in these clinical conditions. And, you know, in the beginning, there was a reason exposure therapy was addressed initially, and that is because basically it was easy to do. There weren't any real high demands on complex user interaction in these environments. Essentially, you built an environment that addressed what the person feared, fear of flying, heights, public speaking, and have the capability to make it progressively more provocative or scary in order to foster the idea of confronting something you fear and extinguishing the fear response to it by that confrontation in a safe environment. And so, you know, if we look at how dog training works, or rather how classical conditioning works, you know, and I'm sure this is review for everybody, but I'll just run through it quick. Unconditioned stimuli leads to an unconditioned response. Neutral has no response unless the neutral stimuli is paired with the unconditioned stimuli. And then with repeated pairings, eventually the conditioned stimulus or neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus, leading to its capability to evoke a conditioned response. And we believe that fear extinction and fear conditioning and extinction follows the same kind of a pattern here with little Albert from some early work here, pairing something that was a soft, cuddly animal like a rat, evoking no fear response, but pairing it with a startling stimuli like a loud noise. Then the rat becomes a conditioned stimuli, producing a conditioned response. Now, by presenting extinction trials, presenting the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus over time, eventually that fades. And whether you're a pure behaviorist or, you know, you believe that, you know, people cognitively appraise this stuff and make decisions, you know, we see fear reduction with repeated exposures. And memory reconsolidation is essential to this process. You know, the idea is, you know, your memory is not the memory of the event, but rather the memory of your last memory, and that by doing this repeatedly, you're actually affecting a brain change and reducing the fear by reconsolidating the memory. Now, over the years, VR has been applied in simple phobias like these here. So, for example, if you had claustrophobia, you happened to be in Spain in 1997, they put you in this room and gradually close the door and move the wall in on you. You know, in other areas, you got a lot of scientific study was fear of heights. And I stopped listing these studies after 2002 because they became redundant. VR outperforms, in most cases, traditional imagination-only exposure. That's the standard about how exposure has been done prior to the advent of VR. Helping a patient to, with guided imagery, go back and face the fear, pull it up and do it repeatedly over time. Basically, after 2002, many studies have come out, and later on I'll just show some quick meta-analyses. But, you know, it's pretty confirmed that VR is a useful tool for delivering this type of therapy. These were success stories. But, you know, the stimuli, even in the early days, was very primitive. Who would mistake this for the real thing? But we have a very forgiving population, an easy room to work, essentially. People with phobias are very cued to respond to anything that has a whiff of what they're phobic over. And so this would activate skin conductance, sweaty palms, increase heart rate, and so forth. But good news is technology's evolved. You know, we have simulations that are quite a bit more real. We used to say it doesn't have to be so real to activate. Maybe that was an excuse for the fact we couldn't make stuff look real, but now we can. And, you know, and I love this app because it pits your fear of heights against your love of kitty cats. You got to go out there and rescue that cat. And commercial products are popping up all over the place. I mean, there's more companies that have evolved in the mental health and relaxation, mindfulness space in the last 2 years than in the previous 20. And it's based on solid literature, probably the most evolved scientific literature in VR, any VR application area is in mental health and rehab. These meta-analyses, one from our group and one from another group in 2008, documented this, VR outperforming imaginal-only exposure therapy and being as good as in vivo real-world exposure, followed up in 2012 by another group that updated the literature. And in 2015, this meta-analysis documented that not only do you see changes in the therapy and self-report ratings, but people actually it makes a difference in their real-world behavior, that it generalizes to the real thing. So moving on to PTSD, you know, we, of course, I don't have to sell this too hard, have a significant mental health problem with our service members coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And this was really a call to arms in 2004. up to this point, we had built a VR simulation for this, but couldn't get any funding. We modified a game, and we're hoping to get funding and do some lab research with it. But after this article came out, we were approached by Office of Naval Research and built a simulation to address this. And just real quick, I'd probably review for many folks, but PTSD starts off with either direct experiencing, witnessing, or learning about traumatic events, or experience repeated exposure to aversive details of those events. So you don't actually have to be there. Maybe if you keep watching or hearing more and more about the shootings in Las Vegas, you may have a little apprehension about going to large crowds or going to Vegas or going to concerts. Maybe an avoidance that occurs there. But that's one of the key things. Avoidance of cues and places are one of the things that primarily maintain the disorder. Disorder consists of hyperarousal, activation, alterations, commonly emotional numbing, intrusions being the nightmares and flashbacks. But the avoidance of cues and places prevents the person from exposing themselves to the extinction trials, to corrective information that shows that that context is no longer a threat. And so when you avoid something that you fear, you get a reinforcement. That's why we call it two-factor theory when we talk about this in behavioral terms, because there is some operant learning that when you avoid something that you're fearful of, you get a temporary sense of relief, and that reinforces continued avoidance. You fail to actually have the extinction trials. And not everybody develops PTSD when they're exposed to a trauma. So here we have some data from some sexual trauma work done in the early 90s showing that, if we assess people immediately after the traumatic experience, everybody would be diagnosed with PTSD. These symptoms are the natural experience that people have after they've gone through a hellish event. But for most people, over time, there's a natural recovery process. People, whether they kind of get gradual re-exposure to the everyday environment and their fears get reduced, or whatever the process is here, whether it's a reconsolidation of memory with repeated exposure to safe environments that are similar to where you went through a trauma, most people show a natural decline. With PTSD, you don't see that. There's a failure of extinction for whatever reason here, and that's the big question. What's the difference between these two groups? Think of the worst thing that you've ever gone through in your life and how horrible you felt the day after, the week after, maybe a month after. But, as you move on, you adapt, adjust, move forward. And it's not the same thing. With PTSD, this stuff sticks. You feel as bad 6 months as you felt the day after you saw your buddy die on the battlefield in Afghanistan. Doing exposure therapy, while it sounds like torture to a lot of people who don't, follow the behavioral or cognitive behavioral literature, it's actually evidence-based. Evidence-based in terms of doing an imagination. Patient in a clinician's office, closing their eyes, recounting their trauma narrative repeatedly over time. And when the Institute of Medicine evaluated this in 2008, and again in 12 and 14, basically the same findings, that a lot of stuff out there that doesn't work, but we do know the scientific literature supports the process of, within a cognitive behavioral context, helping a patient confront and process difficult emotional memories, trauma-focused therapy, whether you're doing it in imagination, in VR, or having people write narratives like in cognitive processing therapy, where they write a story in the first session about what they went through. These are things that they're not 100%, but there's evidence to show that they have some value. And if you look at some of the early work in this area, Richard Bryant showed if you take people 30 days post-trauma and they're still at a high level of symptoms, you don't do anything with them, 70% at 6 months will be diagnosed with PTSD. And the idea is at 30 days, if they're still showing high levels of symptoms, that might be a marker. You need to address it. Now, people say, oh, you don't need that exposure, you know, just do a supportive counseling, help them forget the past, move forward, forget about this extinction crap. Well, 67% in this study developed PTSD. When you do the prolonged exposure, the number goes down to 22%. So why use VR? Well, you know, if you're doing the traditional treatment, you're relying on the hidden world of imagination, something we can't see, and you're asking someone to do something that they've spent days, months, sometimes years avoiding doing, thinking about the trauma, confronting it, emotionally re-experiencing it. If you do a study, there's a number of studies showing that if you look at skin conductance while people do the trauma narratives, and you don't see much activation, i.e. lower emotional engagement, you see poor outcomes, poor clinical outcomes. So engagement in trauma memory is fundamental. So that's what we do in VR. So here's just a little piece on that.
BraveMind is a form of virtual reality exposure therapy that combines video game-based simulations with one of the most widely used evidence-based therapies. Making use of the University of Southern California Institute for Creative Technology's expertise in immersive technologies and emotional storytelling, BraveMind is a treatment option with appeal for today's digital generation. BraveMind gradually recreates trauma-relevant scenarios that clinicians can use to help patients confront and process difficult memories in a safe and supportive environment.
Stimulus presentation to have it somewhat mirror or mimic the events that the patient is doing in their active trauma recounting. And here's what some of those simulations look like. Everything is controlled by the clinician. We're not eliminating the clinician here.
By going through it there, it's not going through my head at night when I'm trying to sleep or when I'm with my wife, when times when I don't want it to come up and me start thinking about it. Traumatic things are not normal. You cannot handle the things that we've seen and done. And this is a tool that has helped me out tremendously.
Reliving the worst moments of his life has helped him to move on with his life.
I'm probably about 80% of who I was before I left, but I think that's pretty good after seeing and doing the things that we've done.
For Nightline,
So
this is Dan
essentially
Harris
a tool for delivering
Atlanta.
extinction trials, to foster extinction learning by re-experiencing this stuff in a safe, supportive environment, hopefully reconsolidating memory, leading to extinction learning. Now, keep in mind, as cool as all this stuff is, not self-help. It's a tool to extend the skills of a clinician. Clinicians delivering this stuff, so they do it by, and this is one of our early versions of the system, you pop the user in an environment, or you can move them to a different location. Once they're interacting in the environment, the clinician can monitor what they're seeing, can adjust the time of day, lighting conditions, ignite an explosion in a location, have people pop up in the environment, and so on. And we can also, of course, monitor physiological, psychophys markers, heart rate, skin conductance, respiration, and so forth. This is what the newer version looks like, a separate screen so for the clinician to see what's going on in the simulation. But a lot of new features have evolved. It's gone through 3 iterations thus far. And we're not just visual and auditory, we also are messing with multi-sensory stuff, delivering smells, vibrations. If you're driving in a Humvee, we run the sound through subwoofers under a platform. You feel that vibration. Use of physical props. When we did initial user tests, we actually sent a system to Iraq, had people weigh in on what was good and bad. One of the things they said, the gamepad, all right, fair enough for driving a Humvee, but on a foot patrol, the gamepad was unnatural and distracting. So listening to your user group, we came up with the idea of using a fake mock weighted weapon and put a thumb mouse controller on it for navigation purposes in the environment. So the clinical research in this area. First feasibility and safety trial, first 20 treatment completers, they were all folks who had tried some form of evidence-based care with no good clinical outcome. These aren't just first-timers, 8 years average in the military, multiple deployments. And we saw good outcomes with a small sample down at Camp Pendleton and Naval Medical Center, showing PTSD symptoms reducing and being maintained and actually improving at 3-month follow-up. These are the individual data points. 16 no longer met PTSD criteria at the end of treatment. 4 achieved no benefit. Also saw gains on these other self-report measurements, Beck Anxiety Scale, and the PHQ-9 Depression Scale. Other studies have replicated that effect. This one is interesting because it just came out. It shows pretty dramatic effect, but what happened here is that this is a 3-week intensive treatment. It's not the 1 session a week or 2 session a week approach it's traditionally used. And you know, people are making a commitment. So there might be a motivational factor here. People that are willing to, in this case, fly to Orlando and live there for 3 weeks have to be pretty motivated to get well. But you see these positive clinical outcomes, and it flies in the face of the rule of thumb in most clinicians that you can only do at most 2 sessions a week because you need time for that memory consolidation to occur. This is showing every day. In the morning, you do the VR exposure. In the afternoon, you do supplemental. Every day, you know, self-help, clinical treatment, cognitive behavioral stuff, anger management, things unrelated to PTSD, but things that are relevant for returning service members. So we don't know how much that improves versus the exposure and extinction trials from the PTSD, but nonetheless, it points in a direction that we need to explore. And there's some unpublished data at Emory University where they find people that are committed in a 2-week intensive program showing significantly better outcomes than dragging it out over 10 weeks. And part of that research with Barbara Rothbaum, another study showing this over time, gradual reductions over time lasting a year out, but also now up in the bar in terms of what we're measuring, not just that last data. There is the clinician-administered PTSD scale, structured interview, still self-report. And, you know, we all know self-report is suspect at times, but now looking at startle response, you know, a classical conditioning paradigm, pairing different neutral stimuli with puffs of air to the neck or loud sounds. You see that people with PTSD tend to condition faster to the conditioned stimuli, get the conditioned response, and extinguish slower. Now, over time in our clinical trial, mirroring the clinical outcomes, we see reduction in that startle response and reduction in cortisol reactivity when presented in a VR simulation, an on-rails VR simulation of provocative events. Now, the work's expanded to a couple of areas, and I'll get into a little bit of the stuff with sleep and reconsolidation out of this, but just want to mention these. One more recent study is with military sexual trauma, a big issue in the military, as in civilian life is obvious. And so what we did with this was we built out some of the military relevant stuff, Afghanistan, Iraq stuff, bases and so on, but most sexual trauma in the military occurs around Camp Pendleton, US bases, local towns. So we had to build out a bunch of civilian context for this. Now keep in mind, this is the most provocative thing you'll see is a character that follows you around like the Terminator. And most clinicians don't use that feature. Essentially, we're not recreating sexual assaults. We're creating the context that people have reported these things to have occurred and doing exposure in those settings. And in the first, this has just been submitted to Journal of Anxiety Disorders, first safety feasibility trial, just 11 patients, so not definitive, but we do see similar clinical outcomes, and also the depression scale reductions follow the same pattern. We also see just pure heart rate changes in terms of pre and post treatment. And you know, we haven't really dug into the real details of the physio, psychophys measurements, but you know, we just did the analyses in the last month on the raw data here, and we see lower baseline at post-treatment and lower activations in the heart rate there. We also do another thing in this study, which I want to mention real quick, because we're really trying to move away from just relying on self-report data. We want to look at what are the other available things that can give us some kind of insight into assessing progress or assessing for diagnostic purposes whether somebody actually has PTSD or other types of wounds of war that significantly impair their everyday functioning. So one application we developed was to create a virtual human clinical interviewer, but not just create a virtual human and ask you questions, but a character that can update their response based on your facial expression, body gesture, vocal prosody. And I'll just show an example of that here. We can quantify these behaviors over time. So we have an automatic behavior analysis system here, and you'll see it here. So on the right is the interviewer.
Hi, I'm Ellie. Thanks for coming in today.
This is
I was created to talk
what's
to
going
people
on
in
under
a
the
safe
hood.
and secure environment. I'm not a therapist, but I'm here to learn about people and would love to learn about you. I'll ask a few questions to get us started. And please feel free to tell me anything. Your answers are totally confidential. Are you okay with this?
Yes.
So, how are you doing today?
So for the first 7 minutes, you do rapport
I'm
building.
doing well.
You know, just get
That's
used to
good.
talking to the character. But then after that,
Where are
she
you
slips
from
into
originally?
open-ended projective questions like
When
this.
was the last time you felt really happy?
When was the last time? I don't know. Yeah, I'm not someone who's really like, I don't have any real highs. I feel like I'm a level person. It's just happy. I guess to answer your question, probably a couple months ago.
I noticed you were hesitant on that one. Would you say you were generally a
So
happy person?
that response is based on a real-time
gen-
analysis of the behavior. So if he was to say, oh, I'm happy last week, I went to a party, you know, I hung out with my friends, had a great time, she would just move on to the next question. But by picking up these behavioral markers in real time, she has a variety of follow-up questions. And a lot of times the follow-up questions actually give you a lot more information. Now we've used this in a number of studies, large data, you know, big data analysis with tons of people in known groups of psychological distress and healthy controls, and find real clear behavioral markers in terms of facial expression, of course, happy, sad, intensity of smile, facial touching or self-adapting, fidgeting, downward gaze, but also a lot of good measures with vocal prosody or vocal parameters, not what you say, but how you say it. So in that sexual trauma trial, we found a couple of facial expression markers that are correlated with anxiety that showed reductions over time. As well, some of those markers actually were moderately correlated with the clinical outcomes because we're trying to expand out. You know, we don't want it to be unity. We don't want it to be full-on correlations because then just use the clinical interview. But this is measuring something in the ballpark, but as well, maybe something a little different. And the same thing with a vocal tenseness measure that we've isolated. And this data is still being picked apart. I'm sure there's going to be other measures that we'll have, but you know, basically they interacted with the virtual interviewer before treatment and at 3-month follow-up. And this stuff now is going to be correlated with all the psychophys results as we evolve that. So essentially, you know, what we're trying to do here is add a third leg to the assessment stool. The only 3 things you can measure in people: what they tell you, what their body tells you, and what their behavior tells you. And we're trying to add that into the mix now. So with all that said, big effort in this area to find ways to enhance treatment, still operating from the extinction paradigm. And in one case, we're running a study. We're just completing data collection now, and soon we'll be breaking the blind on a large-scale randomized control trial, 300 patients over 3 sites, looking at this drug D-cycloserine in old tuberculosis, antibiotic medication that has a direct effect on the amygdala, fight or flight area in the brain, as we all know, and is believed in lab studies with animals to enhance extinction learning. And some mixed results with people, but you know, a lot depends on the dose and the time frame. Essentially, you take the medication before you go into the extinction or the exposure session, And in this case, in 2004, Barbara Rothbaum's group showed better performance in fear of heights, people taking the medication before the exposure session, better performance fear of heights using VR. And more recently, Joan DeFede, who's also a colleague on our study, showing that's both VR for World Trade Center PTSD, and both showing good clinical outcomes, but the white circles is the decycloserine group, so perhaps we're going to get an effect where we can reduce the number of sessions, or maybe with mass training, maybe we'll find a better effect, but the idea is to amplify the effects by direct brain stimulation activities, if you will, but with a pharmacological agent. Some of our other work has also shown that if you look at fMRI data pre and post treatment, small sample, 18 subjects, you see changes in activation levels in the brain as you would predict after treatment. You know, again, documenting the extinction paradigm. As I mentioned before, developing new ways to assess. I mean, these are all extinction conditioning paradigms that various folks have studied and published research on. So the thing I want to focus on a bit now in the last bits of the talk is, I'm not going to talk about the work we've done with HRL. I'm assuming that'll be presented at the talk at noon. But the idea that sleep is relevant to the reconsolidation process and may serve to foster better extinction learning. And so a number of noteworthy studies showing generalization of extinction, not only to the extinction stimuli, the conditioned stimuli, but to stimuli that is not the same, but close to it, that hadn't been extinguished. So seeing generalization, which is relevant when you're looking at VR simulation in a clinical context, generalizing to real world activities. So some interesting findings there showing that sleep promoted this in a controlled setting. Also in another study, this one's a little more complex, but basically showing, you know, that when you measure rapid eye movement, sleep, you see attenuated, it's related to attenuated extinction response and stronger activation areas of the brain relevant to PTSD. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't want to fumble around trying to deeply explain it. But there was also some interesting finding that the folks that showed greater REM sleep also had a different response to the extinction trials before the sleep. They put people through the extinction, give them a 90-minute period to sleep. If they're able to go to sleep during that period, how many got REM sleep, how many achieved REM sleep during that period, and then looking at the outcomes. And the ones that got lower, had lower REM sleep during that period, also showed slower extinction pre. There might be a trait issue going on here. More recently, my colleague down at Long Beach VA, who is a partner on our multi-site decycloserine trial, showed that people with sleep apnea show reduced responses to exposure therapy. And this is retrospective. It's looking at data that had already been collected and then looking at their incidence of problems with sleep, particularly sleep hygiene. And, you know, you can make a case here that impaired sleep may have an impact on this extinction process and so forth. So, you know, the model here is that, you know, people exposed to trauma, some level of fear conditioning, the acute symptoms, but some people adapt to just move on and they re-expose themselves in everyday life to these events, you know, self-extinguish, if you will, and natural recovery. But perhaps people with sleep problems are the ones that end up developing PTSD, or after treatment or in the midst of treatment, they still have these sleep problems, and it may have an impact on extinction learning. So this opens the door. The idea is ways we can enhance sleep or enhance memory consolidation in the brain during sleep with various procedures or other procedures, and basically, you know, look at these approaches to improve sleep, memory consolidation, and extinction learning. And this has relevance beyond the military, of course. You know, our sexual trauma work was designed with the intent that if, you know, it was safe and showed some efficacy, that then it could be applied for many folks that experience trauma in their everyday life outside of the military. Let's see, I've got 4 minutes, so I was gonna talk about resilience because we are doing studies where we put people, before they go on a deployment, in VR simulations, immersive narrative simulations, where they're exposed to traumatic events before they go into a simulation, teach them cognitive behavioral strategies for dealing with that stress. And I don't have time, but I was gonna make the case that perhaps you can amplify the learning, because we know that you pre-expose somebody to a threat stimuli, but no unconditioned response because it's still neutral. And you do that repeatedly by a process we call latent inhibition, that if they're actually exposed to the real thing later on, you have a lower incidence of fear conditioning. So the idea of stress inoculation, pre-exposure, can we amplify those effects in training to whether it's service members before they go to war or police officers, which I think police officers is the big area for me right now, because I think, many of these folks would not qualify for the diagnosis of PTSD, but certainly, they don't have all the symptoms, but they certainly, I believe, have subthreshold PTSD that makes a toxic combination of the hyper-arousal and the emotional numbing. And if you put those two things together, you might not get diagnosed with PTSD, but the repeated exposures to the things that are occupational hazards in that environment, you've got a toxic recipe for a quick trigger finger. And I think so we need to address in the academy, preparing people for what they're going to be facing, as well as maybe not call it therapy, but annual reset training, or call it something else, but ways that we can deal with this. Anyway, from a clinical perspective, we know all these facts here. You can safely use it. It's not VR therapy. A lot of people say, oh, we're doing VR therapy. No, we're using VR to deliver an evidence-based approach. We call it VR exposure, and the same thing with any other area, where we look at what works in the real world and amplify or extend the effects or make them more accessible by using VR. More effective than just imagination alone. Doesn't have to be an exact replica to have a positive effect. Tool to extend clinician skill. Military has driven the research to fuel transition to civilian use. And by 2020, with mobile phone-enabled VR headsets and so on, this is going to be standard practice in clinical applications. Now, from more neuroscience perspective, a lot of serious efforts to study brain and behavior with PTSD. VR provides a controlled stimulus environment that supports research in this area. Extinction is well measured with VR conditioning protocols, and sleep factors are implicated in this. And so can brain stimulation methods impact sleep and improve measurable clinical outcomes, advance memory reconsolidation, and what about resilience training? And so to close, since I'm not going to cover the resilience end, let me jump ahead. And I want to thank some of our corporate partners that have sponsored our work and provided free systems to a number of VAs. And just mention there's a lot of events in this area. This is no longer a niche, fringe area. This is a valid area of research using latest technology. And if anybody's interested in a copy of this talk, I'll post it online, all the video and all the stuff that's involved in it. And with that, thank you. I'm probably at the end, if there's any questions, I don't know if we have time. Yeah.
So, the fundamental issue that I've always worried about with PTSD or any of these things is that, you put somebody back in the situation and they have the fear response, and it gets reinforced because they have the response themselves. So it's kind of have this sort of Hebbian way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Students of a response
That the emotional response is the reinforcer.
Right. So the question is, what is the UCS?
True.
How do you think about the way that VR works with getting us to understand that better? Do you have a thought about it?
Yeah, well, I think we have focused on the conditioned stimuli, and we need to focus a bit more on putting people in environments that look like that, but are in everyday context to help them drive down a freeway with a lot of trash, which is a provocative scenario for veterans coming back because it brings up the memories of where an IED had been hidden or going under an overpass, things like that. I think the field probably could advance by doing a bit more of that so that you're associating the change with the everyday functional environment. So, I mean, you have a point, but, you know, your initial point, though, about fear of re-traumatization, we don't really see that. You know, we do see the good clinical outcomes. We do see treatment non-successes, but in one study by Deborah Vidal, where she tracked down people that dropped out of therapy and did an evaluation of them a year later, she saw no increase in their PTSD symptomology, you know, compared to their baseline assessment. And she got like 80% of those folks. So, you know, I think you have a valid point. You know, you're activating after memory in a safe environment, and you know, we like to say it's all behavioral and extinction learning, but we're doing a hell of a lot of, you know, cognitive processing, addressing faulty perceptions, fostering cognitive reappraisal. But you know, valid point. I mean, we're in the Model T phase with this. It's a powerful, emotionally evocative technology. Can't treat it like a video game. So, well point, well taken.
Do you think, I know it was ethically fine, do you think it would be possible to induce PTSD in a virtual reality environment?
We haven't tried that yet. Yeah, you know, I mean, you know, theoretically, I mean, come on, you know, physical energy in the real world leads to a sensory thing that we create an impression of, and that can have an effect of hurting us in the long run with a conditioning experience, you know, like trauma. Could you theoretically build a world that does that? And, you know, I don't see much, in a lot of ways, I don't see much difference between the real world and VR in terms of what goes on in the brain sometimes. I mean, we leverage that. We fool the brain, you know, even though, you know, if you do one of these plank walks over a pit, you know, and these are common things. You know, put on a headset and you look down and there's a pit, but there's a plank you got to walk over. And as you're doing it, I did one of these at Stanford last week, and I'm walking like this. I know I'm on solid ground. I'm not going to fall in that pit. But my brain, maybe the amygdala is reacting, well, my frontal lobes are saying, don't worry, don't worry. You know, so we are messing with the brain in certain ways that we need to understand better. And, you know, the mix of, you know, real good brain science along with what I mostly focus on the clinical side and trying to improve assessment is going to be important. You know, we've had about, 125 years of psychology as a science studying human behavior, 150.
More. We did stop in Europe.
Yeah, William Wundt, yeah, okay, all right. So we've had a long history studying behavior and interaction in the real world. Now we're going to have to spend a bit of time understanding behavior and interaction in the virtual world and how it has good and bad impacts. So far, we've been constrained, and the outcomes, I think, have been positive. But what you're proposing is not far-fetched. Okay. One more here.
Yeah, the Sim Sensei work, I'm just curious, like, give me an idea of how autonomous that therapist was. Was it really responding autonomously in real time to the reaction and coming up with follow-up questions?
You know, if there's one behavior that's extreme, it'll respond to that. But if there's a collection of behaviors that reach a certain threshold, then the character will have not a lot of follow-up responses, but we'll have, you know, 3 or 4 that the software will pick. And that's mainly to foster credibility in the interaction. You know, all of a sudden when the character's saying, I noticed that was difficult for you, are you generally a happy person? It's like, whoa. And the stuff I hadn't had time to talk about was we find that, as creepy as that might sound, people reveal more events of sadness and feel afterwards less worry about impression management and risk to reveal and self-disclose information when they interact with the character, as opposed to if they think the character is being run in the back room by Woods of Oz control. Also found higher reporting of symptoms, PTSD, or mental health symptoms when interacting with Ellie, or we name our characters, interacting with the Sim Sensei, as opposed to when they come back and they fill out the post-appointment checklist, which is behavioral symptoms. They just go through no, 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 no. We gave that anonymously as well, not under military records, still no, 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 no. But when the character will say, hey, how's your sleeping been? After some rapport building, all of a sudden the person will say, well, you know, since I got back, you know, I've been waking up a lot at night. Well, can you tell me more about your sleep? And, well, you know, sometimes I have dreams about, like, all of a sudden, you know, that no is a yes, and we just published that. You can send me an email, I can send you the papers. Real quick.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's an application for VR, particularly in the short phase after the trauma, to help reduce post-traumatic growth.
Yeah. You know, people have done that kind of debriefing stuff after natural disasters, you know, saying hit it hard in the beginning, and found that you might be interfering with the natural recovery process, particularly people are kind of being pushed into it. They don't seek it on their own. And that was some studies that were done a while back. However, Barbara Rothbaum has done some studies in the emergency room with battered spouses, people physically who intimate partner violence, and found a very light psychoed, you know, sensitivity kind of a thing has improved outcomes. So, you know, we're still messy on that.